So this morning, the gifts that just keep on giving, we have another special guest with us that I'm excited to introduce. Dr. Brandon Brunning is going to be our guest speaker this morning. And he is not only a dear friend, but many of you have gotten to know Dr. Brunning. He is assistant professor of English and Hebrew Bible at Anderson University in Anderson, Indiana. After he finished his undergraduate degree, where he also studied at Oxford, he got his MTS and his PhD from Notre Dame and did studies at Tel Aviv University and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He is a scholar and a specialist in the Hebrew Bible and Second Temple Judaism. And I'm excited to have him with us. He's worshiped with us before, but I think this is the first time that you're speaking here. And so let's give a really warm welcome to Dr. Brandon Brunning.
Shabbat Shalom, whoever that guy is. Boy, he must be somebody exciting I'm looking forward to hearing from too. I really am delighted to be with you all. Can you all hear me okay? I'm a little bit quiet, and so, okay, you're good? All right, good. More of a teacher than a public speaker or a preacher. So I'd kind of like, as I was thinking through the Parsha today, and because we're also going to, I think, are we definitely doing the Q&A? Okay, all right. And then, we were talking about having a time for Q&A and study afterwards as well. I thought that what we would do here that fit really well with the idea of opening up the story. A few days ago, I got to visit the synagogue in person for the very first time with the Eatons. And I heard the story of the stained glass window, and it also gave credit to Gary Halsell for helping bring Lawrence's design to eventually here to Simchat. And so it's really interesting to hear a story that has been meaningful to this congregation over and over again, and yet have some new information, some new character, some new person spotlighted in the telling of the tale. And I think that fits very well with what we see in the story of Joseph and his brothers. I'll come back to whether or not we should call it Joseph and his brothers. But I want to start also with what we see behind me, in front of you, over the ark, over that stained glass. V'hadavar niyeh basar. V'yishchan b'tochenu. Now, the Greek of John doesn't allow for this, but in Hebrew, you can allow the repointing or the revocalization of the letters. Davar could also be dibur. We have different ways of talking about the word, the utterance, the logos, the memra if you're in Greek or Aramaic. But we use this as a way to talk not just about the individual words, but about the stories, the ways we name things and the ways our stories relate the things we name. Think about our stories, the story that you have of who you are. That introduction was quite a story about me. I think that sometimes we end up in stories about who the hero is and who the villain is and who did what. And I think that's where Joseph and his brothers end up. The story becomes flesh. It becomes the history, the way that we live. And so I really want us to kind of consider some of the examples of retelling the story that we have today. So because the stories we live in together are also the stories we sometimes don't live in together. We have a tale that begins with Vayigash Judah. Okay? Judah comes forward. This is the moment when Benjamin has been discovered. Well, he's been framed. And Judah comes forward and says this long narration of what it means if he, Judah, returns without Benjamin. It's beautiful. It's stirring. I know it's, for many people, one of the most moving and favorite parts. So if we don't get to all of the things that you love about it, we'll save that for the Q&A. But when he comes forward to Joseph, Joseph then responds with a different story. He tells his brothers, yes, I'm Joseph, your brother, the one whom you sold. But don't tell that story about yourselves. Don't look at yourselves that way. Whatever you did for evil, God was doing for life. It revises the story. But one of the things that I've been thinking about is the very first thing Joseph says to his brothers is, Ani Yosef, Od Avichai, is my father still alive? And that's really where Joseph is thinking. He's not thinking about the brothers. Not anymore. Ha'od Avichai. What's important is not who did what or who was responsible for what, the blame, the praise. But I think that's also what we do when we look at the story of Joseph, when we call it, well, the story of Joseph. The last few weeks, as we heard, as we were talking to the kids, right, this story has been unfolding from something that really begins with, right, we think of Joseph, the 17-year-old spoiled kid who always tattles on his brothers and, flaunts his special coat that his father gave him, and understandably makes all of his brothers really resentful. But let's consider where that story actually begins. It's introduced, and this is something that I think those of us who have been in the parables study will appreciate. It's introduced in a way that makes us maybe rethink whether this is the Joseph story. So in the parables class, one of the things that we were looking at was Amy Jo Levine's short stories by Jesus, in which she challenges some of the conventional ways that we learn to read the parables of Yeshua in the Gospels. So for example, she says, do we call the parable of the Good Samaritan, or maybe that already tells us who we're looking for as the hero? He's the guy who does the right thing. But in the story around the parable, right, what is Yeshua asking the man who asks him the question, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? Yeshua asks him two questions. What is in the Torah? But also, how are you reading? It's not just what's there, it's how you're reading. And the things that we tell ourselves about the stories, the ways we name and the ways we tell the stories that connect what we name, that is also shaping things. After all, that man's question was, so who is my neighbor? And Yeshua doesn't ask him which one of these three loved the mugged man like a neighbor. He asks him, which of these three seems it to you was neighbor to the man who fell in the hands of the bandits? It shifts the way we read the story, in whose perspective we read the story. How do you love your neighbor when you can't even choose your neighbor, when the person who comes by the road and helps you isn't the person you would expect, the person you might be honored to receive help from, the person you might actually be a little uneasy receiving help from? And you can't do anything. What does love your neighbor look like then? Now, That's just an example of how telling the story, right, even naming the story, changes the way we look. Think back weeks ago in the Torah portion. At the end of the portion where Jacob and Esau are reunited, Jacob goes in the land and Esau goes his own way, we end that parsha with an account of where Esau goes. It starts with Vayashev Esav. Esau dwelt in the land of Mount Seir. It says then, right after that, Ele Toldot Esav. These are the generations of Esau. Yeah, Toledot is usually then the way we introduce a genealogical list, right? All the begats in the King James Version of Genesis. But Toledot is also sometimes the beginning of a history, a narration, a story about people. So, which is it? Well, after Ele Toldot Esav, we get Ve'ele Shemot B'nai Esav, right? These are the names of the sons of Esau. So in that pattern, we're expecting to see the next parsha, well, it's actually titled Vayeshev, right? But now it's Vayeshev Yaakov. So Jacob dwelt in the land where his father had, Jacob settled in the land where his father had dwelt. And then it says, Ve'ele Toledot Yaakov. These are the generations of the Bnei Yaakov, of the sons of Jacob. So what do we expect next? Ve'ele Shemot Bnei Yaakov, or Bnei Israel. But what do we see instead? We see that 17-year-old brat telling his dreams to his brothers. When do we see Ve'ele Shemot Bnei Israel? Not until the beginning of the next book, which takes its name in Hebrew from that verse, Shemot. These are the names. The whole story from that 17-year-old brat that we've been reading about, all the way to the end of Genesis, something about that is telling us this is what it means to be the children of Jacob, to be the children of Israel. Something about this is telling us it's not just a list of names, it's also a way of telling the story of what it means to be Israel. So, is this a story of Joseph and his brothers? Is this the story of, right, we have that little interlude where Judah goes off by himself for a little while, and he loses first one son, then another, and he tries to hold and protect his third son to keep him from the same fate, and ends up confronted by Tamar, who simply says, "Do you recognize whose things these are?" And he says, "She was more righteous than I." What's that story if this is the story of Joseph? If it's the story of Joseph and Judah, that's also important for the way we read the story. But what if we read the story as the story of what it means to be Israel? What is Joseph's reaction when Judah comes forward and retells the story now? Judah, who has now lost two sons. Judah, who has now said to his father, "I know you can't let Benjamin go, but we can't get food otherwise." This Judah now says to his father, "I will stand surety. I will stand a sinner before you if I don't come back with Benjamin." This Judah is able to tell the story differently. Notice what he says. Our father had a wife who had two sons. Our father's wife had two sons. He doesn't claim, right? He's talking about Rachel. He doesn't claim his own mother, Leah. He's not talking about Bilhah and Zilpah. He's accepting a story in which his father favored one wife. Think of the humility that has come to him for that. Or at least the expediency. It's kind of hard to tell, right? He sometimes, they all kind of need to tell each other what they think the other needs to hear. This is something that all of these guys do because, well, they are sons of Jacob after all. He's good at that too. But Judah has changed, or changed enough, that this telling of the story moves Joseph. Now, when Joseph first saw Benjamin, remember, he just about can't hold himself back. In fact, the same word in Hebrew, he can't hold himself back, is repeated here in this scene. When he first saw Benjamin, though, he couldn't hold himself back. And think about, right, the room is full of all of his Egyptian, servants and his brothers. He can't hold himself back, so he runs away. He removes himself from the situation. But here, he has just enough understanding and command of himself to say, everybody out. Okay. But is everybody out? No. His brothers stay there. You ever thought about that? Why do his brothers stay there? He just commanded, let no one stand here, right? Let everyone get out. What language did he use? He would have commanded everybody out in Egyptian. His brothers didn't understand. They just stood there wondering what in the world is going on. And they're left there with this powerful man they don't recognize, whom they are very afraid of. So, that's a change also. He can't contain himself any longer. He can't keep up the facade. He can't keep the story going that he's the big macher in Egypt. But he then reveals himself as Ani Yosef ha'od avichai. I'm Joseph. Is my father still alive? The brothers are perplexed. They don't know what to do with this. They're just dumbstruck. Meaning they're not able to speak. They're not able to tell a story anymore. They're not sure what story they're in anymore. And this is exactly what happens. When we see the story change, when we see things happen that don't fit, think about our own lives. Think about our lives as community. Think about our lives, certainly the life of this community, but the life of the larger Messianic community. There are moments where things happen and we just keep telling the same old story and ignoring the things that happen. And the things that happen, the things that happen, the things that happen, they all add up. And then something happens and we have to tell a different story. What we see is at that point, it's not the end of the story because it always needs to be retold. After all, if the pattern tells us that we should expect here not this long story of Joseph and his brothers, but the story that starts the Exodus, then this is a story that we've already heard. It's not the first time. We're retelling the story the first time we hear it. We're already knowing that this is the story of the Exodus, the story that makes Israel Israel, the story that makes Israel's God the God of the Exodus. We know that we're in that story already, and we tell the story of Joseph and his brothers knowing that this is what's going to get us into Egypt. So we know that when we hear him say, whatever you did for ill, God did for good. There's a different story here. God did for life. But we also know that life in Egypt is short-lived. We know that there's more to that story. We know that that story is a retelling, but it's also a telling that's not going to be the final story either. So when we come to stories and we retell them, when we find something that's making sense of the world we live in, and it doesn't, what do we do with that? We retell the story. Many of us have personal stories we tell and we say, this is what made me who I am. Or we have stories about, this is what broke me. This is what shamed me. some point we need a new story. But even that new story is not the last one. We retell it, and we retell it, and we retell it. These are the generations of the children of Israel. Over and over and over. What story will we find ourselves in? A story of prayer, a story of study, a story of discipleship together in community. What story will we have? And what story will we keep telling? So I'm hoping that afterwards we'll have a chance to spend some time together thinking more about this story and about the importance of retelling and reinterpreting, because that's what we do over and over and over again. As Ben Bagbag says in Pirkei Avot, turn it and turn it again. Everything is in it. So let's turn to the one who holds good and life for us. Let's turn to one another. Let's turn to hearing what God has for us, because after all, it is the word Shema, listen. Listen, O Israel, the Lord is our God. The way we name, the way we tell that story that brings together life and good. Shabbat Shalom.